Overcoming by Purefoy's Girl. Chapter 3. There was no instruction, no familiarization when Will was finally led away, weary and resigned. The butler, Mr. Hawkes, had his orders to take Will straight to the relative safety of his suite and deposit him there, and that was precisely what he did. Will, his eyes wide and frightened and taking in the vast house, moved in his wake, too tired to sort the various scents that vied with those he had already learned. "Here you are, Mr. Graham. The houseboys have brought your luggage in," Mr. Hawkes said, opening the door to let him into a lovely suite made up in neutral, pleasant colors, soothing and quiet. "Has your father sent a servant to assist you?" Will shook his head and cleared his throat, softly saying, "No, he did not. I've never had need of a servant to assist me. I'm the youngest child in my family." "If I may be so bold, I would like to pick a member of our staff to assist you now that you are here with us," Hawkes said, giving him a kindly look that brought Will's uncertain smile to the surface. "Would you prefer female or male?" Will, vague with too much happening at once, roused himself enough to say, "I would be more comfortable with a male assisting me. My wardrobe is both female and male, so it would be more convenient to have someone familiar with such things. If there is any such person who can deal with an Omega." "Of course, you are quite right," Hawkes said, nodding a little. "I shall send someone up directly to unpack for you while you take some rest. The suite is yours to use as you wish. The washroom is there through that door. The house has all new plumbing that the family is quite taken with, I'm told. Please, feel free here. After all, Hertford House is now your home." "Thank you very much, Mr. Hawkes," Will said, relaxing just a hair to be away from any prying, interested eyes. He retreated to the window and looked out at the grounds, smiling softly to see the carefully tended gardens and statuary, the small fountains and shade trees beckoning long walks and quiet introspection to sate his boundless curiosity. He was left quite alone, no one bothering him in the least, until a short while later, when there was a soft knock on the door and a smooth, even voice that called, "May I come in, please?" "Yes, come in," he said, moving hastily away from the window and straightening his dress, feeling awkward and fairly caught out. A man, somewhat older than him, came in, pleasantly plump and blond and smiling. He had all that strange absence of true scent that all betas had, lacking any artificial scent that could upset their alpha masters. But he smelt good all the same, clean and wholesome, like laundry drawn in fresh from the line. "Mr. Graham, I'm James Price," he said, inclining his head a little, his smile never slipping. "I would prefer you call me Jimmy. Everyone else does." "Of course, Jimmy, if that's what you like," Will said, relaxing in the face of his comfortable manner. "Mr. Hawkes has informed me you prefer to be called Mr. Graham, and that you have need of a manservant." He made it more of a statement than a question, moving immediately to the dressing room to check the status of the trunks. "I'd be more than happy to operate in that capacity if you wouldn't mind." No, please, that would be fine," Will said, smiling slightly at him. "I'm afraid I was sent with quite a lot of female clothing, but my preference is male, if that is acceptable."
"Oh, whatever you like, I can work with." Jimmy's smile widened as he wrinkled his nose a little, asking, "Little bit overwhelming, isn't it, all this?"
Will nodded, his smile easing and his shoulders relaxing.
"Well, you're in good hands with me, Mr. Graham," Jimmy informed him, opening the nearest trunk and getting to work. "I had the pleasure of working for the Raleighs before being engaged here. Are you familiar with the Raleighs?"
Yes, I am," Will said, returning to the window to look out, chasing the curve of hills and trees to the village proper far in the distance. "My father kept company with the Marquess. I spent several summers with their children when we were very small." It had, in fact, been his father's determination that exposure to other Omegan children was to Will's detriment, and had started the escalating habit of isolating him to cultivate the son he desired, rather than the Omega that threatened to emerge unbidden.
"Well, I was the personal attendant of Samantha Raleigh," Jimmy said, blue eyes sparkling.
"Sam?" Will asked, surprised and pleased. He laughed softly, vastly relieved, and asked, "You're familiar with Omegas, then?"
"Oh, heavens, yes,"
Jimmy said, deftly plucking his clothing free and shaking out the wrinkles, sorting them according to need.
I was with Samantha from the time when they still went by Sam. It was quite a surprise to the family when they suddenly embraced their feminine side. They were always so adamant they be addressed as male. I dare say it was that Dodson boy, don't you?"
Will laughed shyly and nodded, saying, "I would say so, considering they're married now."
"Such a handsome little devil, that Lord Dodson," Jimmy commented, drawing things from the trunk with an illusionist flair. "I'd have swapped too in their place, though Lord Dodson prefers them how they go, be it Sam or Samantha. The two of them spend all their time running about hunting and sporting together, quite in love."
"He was quite the catch," Will admitted, put at ease by Jimmy's chatter and carelessness. It was nice to be close to someone who wasn't alarmed or wary of the fact that he was an Omega. "I remember when Father read the announcement. I was very happy for them both."
"Well, I'm simply delighted to be in your service, Mr. Graham," Jimmy said. "No artifice, just plain good humor and understanding. I'll take excellent care of you. Which, speaking of, why don't I draw you a bath? A good soak can do wonders, and I'm sure you'd like to get all that travel dust off you, wouldn't you? Such lovely curls you have, Mr. Graham. You must be the envy of your sisters."
He moved swiftly to the washroom to draw a bath, chattering like a magpie, which suited Will just fine. He had nothing much to say himself, and appreciated a break in the silence, and the good intentions it implied. He had a good soak, washing up with a pleasant soap that complemented his own natural scent, and dressed in the clothing Jimmy had chosen for their coming supper. Will had requested the clothing he was used to, hoping to feel less vulnerable in male attire.
"The whole household has been fair chomping at the bit to finally lay eyes on you," Jimmy confided, deftly helping Will into his underthings. "Everyone is very excited, you know. It's been quite some time since they've had an Omega marry in. I think the Duke is hoping to get a few little Omegas of the Lecter extraction to offer on the marriage market."
Will blushed, silently yielding to Jimmy's sure hand. The man dressed him expertly in snug breeches, tucking them smoothly into his shiny boots. The shirt was one of Will's more fitted ones, the cinch of his waist emphasized by his waistcoat drawn tight at the small of his back to complement the slight curve of his hips. He lacked the full chest of some Omegas, the budding breasts that some elitists declared were the distinction of a true Omega, but his own physique was supple and trim enough to lend delicacy to the clothing Jimmy had chosen. The watered silk jacket was dark in color but light in weight, a stark frame for Will's pale skin and dark curls. Jimmy exchanged Will's usual knotted neckerchief for his mother's coral pink brooch, pinned at the throat of his shirt, leaving his neck mostly bared. "They'll expect to see you," Jimmy murmured, adjusting the brooch with a discerning eye. "You understand, of course, they are alphas." "Yes, I understand," Will said, realizing that baring his throat was going to be his new norm in a household of alphas. "It's just very strange to do so." "You don't show your throat?" Jimmy gently inquired, no judgment in his question. "No, my father dislikes it," Will said, fingering the brooch. It was his single memento of his mother, and the only piece of jewelry his father had allowed him. "Proper young gentlemen dress accordingly. Bare necks are for ladies and slatterns, he always told me." Jimmy's brows drew together in a slight spasm at that, but he just nodded to put Will at ease, and slipped Will's pocket watch into place, ensuring the chain dangled just so. "Thank you, Jimmy, for taking care of me." "It's my pleasure," Jimmy said, beaming. "Now, follow me, okay? We're heading to the dining room." There was no one else anywhere along the way, as if there was a tacit understanding that Will not catch sight of anyone on his path to the dining room. "Okay, here we are," Jimmy said, pitching his voice low as he drew to a stop in front of a pair of closed doors, where the two footmen waited at the ready to open up for him. He fussed with Will's light jacket, brushing imaginary lint from his shoulders before nodding. "You feel all right?" Will nodded, the sudden strengthening of the alpha sen making him feel a little dizzy. "Deep breaths, okay?" Jimmy urged, smiling a little in soft understanding. "It'll be easier as you become more accustomed to alphas in the future, but this will take some time. Just breathe through it and don't panic." "Yes." Will entered to find the Duke at the table and Hannibal at the window, staring out at the grounds. More footmen were arranging along the walls like furnishings, doing their best to remain unnoticed. Hannibal turned, the force of him stinging Will like a lash. His fingers clenched so hard his nails bit into his palms, but he forced himself to relax, even as every fiber in his being focused in on the alpha surveying him. He could feel Hannibal willing him to look up, to meet his gaze so it could be interpreted as a challenge, a good excuse to make his displeasure known. Hannibal frowned, glaring at the delicate young Omega who refused to look up at him. Someone had dressed him to please, using every artful drape of clothing to display his trim figure, an androgynous beauty in dark watered silk that made the most of his striking blue eyes and dark hair. He was moderately more composed than he'd been earlier, but Hannibal could still sense his unease and guessed the cause. Up until his arrival, the little minx had attached to his father, no doubt using every weapon in his predictably vast arsenal to wheedle what he could from the besotted old codger. Now, however, his Omegan instinct pushed him towards Hannibal, who made no secret of his dislike or refusal to indulge the vapid trivialities of a witless Omega. "Will, please join us," the Duke said, waving off Will's automatic bow. "Hannibal, you as well, please." Will moved around to the Duke's left, causing a baffling ruckus when one of the footmen attempted to seat him, even as Will seated himself. He blushed, embarrassed that the duality of his gender caused such confusion among the uncertain staff, aware of Hannibal's low chortle of mocking laughter. "I trust you're comfortable in your suite?" Grandfather asked at the head of the table, as was his right. "The suite is fine, Grandfather," Hannibal said, seating himself across from Will, finding himself scrutinizing the top of his head when the twit stared down at his empty plate. Irritated, he said, "I still find myself astounded you would allow this creature to sit at your table." Will looked up just slightly. Hannibal saw a flash of temper in those blue eyes and smirked, congratulating himself on unmasking him, just a little. "Will is not a creature, Hannibal," Grandfather said, affronted. "He prefers to be addressed in the masculine, and you will respect that. Thank you." "Ah, but how was I to know?" Hannibal lightly asked, lifting his glass as soon as it was filled. "They are such confused beings, are they not? Unable to decide between male and female on a given day." "You would know by asking, my lord," Will ventured, his voice the soft velvet of sexless youth, neither deep nor high, simply clear and lovely. He raised his glassy, deliberately unfocused blue eyes with a shadow of his prior meekness. "Much as I ask if you are happy to finally be home in the bosom of your family." Hannibal laughed at that one, waiting until the footmen had delivered their first course before saying, "I have been nearly a decade in a country not my own, fighting to save the lives of men who fight for the sake of men who cannot be bothered to fight for themselves, and I return to the bosom of my family to find an intruder has been installed in the place meant for my wife." He took a taste of the consomme before him, nodding to the hovering footman, and turned his attention to the Omega across from him. He was, tellingly, not even attempting to eat. His small shoulders were squared with determination, but his hands remained in his lap, and his eyes stayed half-lidded and staring, seeing nothing while giving the impression of attention. "I wonder what your father was thinking, pulling such a stunt," Hannibal continued, aware of his grandfather's growing irritation. "I imagine by now you've realized that I am not going to roll over and fall dead at your feet, as your father undoubtedly led you to believe. Or are you planning on amassing a small fortune from my grandfather instead?" "I will take nothing from your grandfather without his insistence," Will said, drawing in a deep breath, becoming accustomed to his unwilling husband's scent. It was strongly earthy with a tinge of anger, but absolutely indicative of his primacy of experience and virility. It was difficult for Will not to respond to it, but he did the best he could within the confines of his meager experience. In this moment of relative ceasefire he was able to look at the man he'd been thrown at, and found himself thinking that Hannibal's personality quite matched his looks. His resemblance to the Duke was great, having the same high, stark cheekbones and deep eyes. His mouth, however, was entirely his own, full lips curved in permanent disapproval above a chin that owed allegiance to ancient Greek statuary. Will found him very much like a statue of Apollo he had seen as a child. Cold beauty, removed, dignified, and carved by a masterful, incautious hand. Even the ashen-brown hair cropped close at his nape refused to be out of place with the threat of his displeasure. Every part of Hannibal Lecter's appearance lent credence to Will's growing understanding of him. His dignity was his shield, his esteem of self a boot he used to grind those lesser than he to dust. He knew well his own worth, and knew well that Will was not of worth. Will twitched slightly, stung by it all over again, the view of himself through Hannibal's eyes reopening wounds left by his father's heavy hand that had barely begun to heal. It was nothing he could control. It simply was. Without even meaning to, he found himself echoing Hannibal's coldness and steely reserve. "Ah, yes, I suppose you will get nothing from us. Nothing but a match to make any sane person weak with envy, access to a fortune you've had no hand in amassing, and luxury to rival even the king's lauded concubine," Hannibal said, quietly irritated that he just continued to sit there, placid and calm, giving Hannibal that damnable Omegan stare. Empty-headed, vain little opportunists, the lot of them. Yet you sit here unable to hold conversation in polite company, waiting for some gracious alpha to tell you everything will turn out just as you wished, and you never need worry for any lack. I am unprepared, grandfather, to be burdened with something so useless and ineffectual. You will moderate your speech, Hannibal, the Duke warned. Will is neither a burden nor any inconvenience. He is your spouse, and he is here by my decree, and you will treat him with the respect he is due. And what respect is that? Hannibal snapped, by now all of them uncomfortable down to the footman. Tell me, dear grandfather, what feats this confusion has performed to lie so heavily in your esteem? Or did you simply look at him and lose your wits, as he no doubt considers is normal? The Duke slammed his hand down onto the table so hard that the silverware jumped. Will jumped too, a distressed noise breaking from him that he quickly tried to bite back. The two alphas bristled, a contest of wills that had no clear good ending. The Duke won by habit of power rather than strength, saying, "I will not subject Will to your nasty temper, Hannibal. Will, if you please." Your Grace, my lord," Will said to them, standing up on shaky legs, visibly trembling as he quit the table and moved towards the doors. "He's a lovely young thing, and will make you a beautiful spouse." "I don't want him," came the clipped, sharp reply, so cutting that Will flinched and hurried his step, his mouth pressing tight to hold back his hurt sound. As the door swung closed behind him, Hannibal clarified, "You said you had chosen my wife. Will is not a woman, grandfather, or need I point that out? You gave me the wrong one. Hannibal, please see reason." "My lord," Mr. Hawks softly said, trying his best to draw Will away from the door, where he stood in shocked, wide-eyed silence, straining to hear. "Please, my lord." "If you like him so much, then why don't you take him?" Hannibal suggested, the anger in his voice carrying through to Will's trembling heart. Take him off my hands before I arrange an accident for him." Will gasped softly and fled, shocked at what he had heard and heedless of Mr. Hawks' well-meaning, soft assurance drifting from behind him that things would be much better come the morning. But Will knew better than that. His strange gift of knowing had never been so thoroughly tested as it had this day, and it was telling him now that Hannibal meant every word. He wasn't indifferent to Will, but actively hated him, not for anything he'd done, but for what he was. He was not welcome in this house, and everything the Duke had told him now tasted like lies. There would be no doing one's duty. There would be no overcoming of Hannibal's bone-deep contempt for the sake of an heir. In fact, his brain screamed at him to run, to go home, to seek the surety of his father, because he was absolutely not safe with Hannibal Lecter. And he knew this to the very core of himself, that this was blatantly, irrefutably true, because he could see it as clearly as he could see himself. "What have I done?" he moaned, curling into the corner of his suite into the smallest ball he could manage, tears rising and overflowing with such force that not even Jimmy's patient, sympathetic soothing could stem them. The Duke of Westvale sat quietly in his bed long after the staff of Hertford House had retired for the night. It was not only age that kept him wakeful, nor mere sleeplessness, but a deep concern whether he was doing the right thing. 20 years ago he had lost his only son and his little granddaughter in an accident that had been entirely avoidable. Hannibal, 10 years old at the time, had come to live with him thereafter, quiet and withdrawn and frighteningly intelligent, surpassing most adults in reason except for one area where he would not bend. Omegas. Hannibal, whose mother had died delivering him, had grown under the care of his father's Omegan concubine, a notorious creature even among concubines, and 10 years of such tender care had hardened the boy to the worst possible impression of the human race's blended sex. When one factored in that entirely avoidable accident, which killed Hannibal's father and sister, was the full fault of the Omega who had so thoroughly ruined him, his contempt was more than understandable. Roland's thoughts turned to Will Graham, a sweet and intelligent little mite whose father had done him serious harm, one could tell just from seeing him. Jimmy had reported the boy bore unusual scars and was skittish as a wild creature, speaking to a life not precisely comfortable before his arrival here. It was apparent that Will had no defense against alphas and that Hannibal fully intended to intimidate him as much as he humanly could. It was Roland's favorite hope that the inner steel which had helped Will survive thus far, as well as his youthful adaptability, might help him penetrate Hannibal's armor deeply enough to make his hard-headed grandson see that there was more to an Omega than tricks and demands. But he worried. Oh yes, he worried. The direct Lecter line was too thin to leave anything to chance, and he wanted this so very, very much. He delved into his nightstand and withdrew an aged and fading miniature portrait, smiling at the sight of his own young man, and that of the older, more somber man next to him. "He has your features, Charles," he murmured to the memory of his dearest companion. "He is you in Omegan form, save for height. You would like him very much, I think." He touched the picture, memory replacing the rough texture of paint with warm and soft skin. Though brief, and forcibly ended by familial obligations, theirs had been a passionate affair near on madness. Not even time and distance had settled it. They had been unable to enjoy a formal union between them, but had hoped that their progeny could some day realize the mingling of their lines, his through his grandson, and Charles through one of his own numerous granddaughters. It would please him immensely to see this delicate Omegan version of himself walk the halls of Hertford House, with the full approval of the law to bear sons of the Lecter line. "Now to convince them this was meant to be," Roland sighed. "He married once without my approval. Now he is married without his own. I will see our blood united, Charles. I swear it." Feeling more determined, he rang for his night servant and requested pen and paper. After scrawling instruction, he sealed it from prying eyes and sent it to Jimmy's capable hands, with his instructions to be given to Will. Reassured on that count, the elderly Duke shifted his weary bones in his bed and closed his eyes, thinking with pleasure of what lovely little great-grandchildren he could expect from the union of Hannibal and Will. The next morning, Hannibal avoided the breakfast table in favor of going riding. He was darkly amused that he was so eager to escape the home that he had been yearning to return to. But then, nothing in his imagination had prepared him for his grandfather's choice in mates. They had talked, finally, all grandstanding set aside. Grandfather had given him a variety of reasons they should have an Omega in the family, and Hannibal had accepted his explanations before giving those of his own. They were fickle, inconstant, flighty little nuisances lacking the brains to save themselves from drowning. It was a wonder the whole lot of them hadn't died of their own ineptitude. Will, he was told, was not like that, nor, he was told, were other Omegas. Hannibal had just been badly exposed, and that was all the Duke would hear on the subject. He drew up short when he caught the now familiar scent of his supposed spouse, a sweet sharpness like well-aged wine and sugary treats, warmly inviting any alpha with a pulse to come calling. He scowled, confronted with the interloper himself, dressed for riding in a bleak and frayed black jacket and worn dark breeches, soft kid gloves on his small hands, and tiny, cracked but polished riding boots hugging his equally slender legs. It was a wonder they even made them so small. Hannibal peevishly wondered if it was used to having everything specially made to suit its tastes. Will, to his credit, did not turn or acknowledge Hannibal in any way. He had been warned by the turn of the wind that his husband had arrived, but he lacked any recourse of escape except the one he was currently saddling. "Where's the stable boy?" Hannibal demanded by way of greeting, looking around for someone to fetch his stallion's saddle. "There is no one here but the two of us," Will said, his tone even and calm. He checked the girth strap and patted the mare's rump, willing his pulse to slow. He was achingly aware of those flashing eyes on him, and blushed to be so keenly watched. "Well, who saddled your mount for you?" Hannibal demanded, sourly passing him to reach the tack-room and look for his saddle. "I did, my lord," Will said, surprising him so that Hannibal actually snorted a laugh. "How amusing," he said, unable to even picture it. He hefted his tack down and moved into the stallion's box, saying, "I should like to see that." "Well, I have just finished," Will said, refusing to engage in verbal sparring, still off-kilter and wary from last night. He had, after all, spoken of arranging an accident. It was not so far from what Will's father had promised him in the aftermath of his perceived infractions. "Perhaps another time." "Grandfather insists I get to know you," Hannibal informed him, expertly dressing his restless stallion despite its help. Will merely stood next to his mount, waiting for a dismissal so that he could escape. He tells me you enjoy sports. He did not, however, inform me that you were in the habit of riding in the morning, as is a habit of my own. I will change to suit, my lord, Will said, hoping to please him in that at least. His absence was a gift he was very happy to give right now, unsettled and frightened as things were. He did not trust his own safety with a man who had everything to gain by hurting him. That is precisely the heart of the problem with you Omegas, Hannibal said, disdain dripping from his even, calm voice, inconstant as a breeze, flitting to whatever catches your attention next. Colorful little butterflies with the intelligence and purpose to match. Will's mouth thinned, but he wisely stayed quiet. When Hannibal looked over the stallion's back at him, he looked away, doing his best to appear meek, to give no reason to find fault. Do you think yourself handsome, Will? Pretty, perhaps. It must be upsetting to realize that you are not as pretty as you think you are. Hannibal informed him, the coy glances aside not fooling him in the least. When I was told I had a wife waiting for me, I did not expect someone so particularly plain as you. Of course, my lord, Will said, mortified. He never thought himself pretty or anything close, though he had wondered once the staff had made him over whenever he was dressed in Mina's clothing. He had looked at himself in the mirror to see if there was something there they found which he did not. But it was the same face staring back at him, same blue eyes and pale skin, an agreeable combination in some that hardly rescued him from being passable in his own eyes. His husband's assessment of his appearance merely piled wood onto the fire of his self-doubt, and he averted his face, trying not to offend. Hannibal finished gearing his mount and led the stallion out into the strengthening sunlight, telling him, "You'll ride with me until I approve of your seat. I won't have you ruining the ducal stable with ineptitude." "Yes, my lord," Will said, apparently only one of two answers he was capable of speaking. Hannibal turned to give his slender spouse a leg up, but Will was already up in his saddle, seated comfortably, with the reins in a soft grip, his crop angled over his thigh. Hannibal huffed at that, irritated that he'd intended to assist it, and grimly thinking that it must assume he was already becoming addled by it. He swung up easily and took up the reins, guiding the stallion out to the park and onto the worn dirt lane where the sun was just beginning to spread its glory. He wanted to have a look at the village and see what changes had come in his absence, something he'd intended to do while alone. When Hannibal chanced to look back, he saw Will looking at the tree line, handling his mount with easy grace and care, lids half lowered against the slight wind that tossed his long curls around his head in a flurry. He rode well, Hannibal would give him that, and he wasn't an incessant talker. In fact, he'd barely said more than 2 words, riding near silently behind Hannibal with his blue eyes restlessly searching, though for what Hannibal couldn't hazard a guess. Escape, maybe? He hoped so. If his unwanted spouse fled and got himself killed, it would make things so much easier. Are you afraid to ride alongside me, or is riding behind some type of subservient Omegan nonsense? He asked, irritated for no other reason than he was spoiling for an argument. He glanced over at Will, who looked the opposite direction, the pale column of his throat flashing in the morning light. It was a delicate throat, as far as throats go, and Hannibal found himself straining to catch his scent. Irritated by it, he pressed, "Well?" Will wordlessly nudged his horse up abreast of him, keeping his head angled down, turned away, unable to make himself look up at the man who looked back at him with such open and impatient contempt. It burned him like a brand to feel such blatant disapproval from the alpha who had so much control over him, and his impulses were in a frenzy of overdrive, pushing him to submit, to pay obeisance, to please him in any way possible, because the alternative was something he simply couldn't control. This was tempered by his fear, by his knowledge that Hannibal was capable of disposing of him for his own aims. But even that could not overcome biology, or his father's dire warning to do anything the Marquess asked of him. "What did you scheme with Anthony to land yourself here, Hannibal asked, wondering with irritation if he was going to be forced to look at the back of the little twit's empty head the whole time. "There was no scheming, my lord," Will answered, his tone neutral and soft. "My father acted according to the terms of the contract." Hannibal laughed at that short bark of humorless noise that made Will start slightly in his saddle. When the man looked back at him, Will looked away again, not sure if he could withstand another attack on his looks so soon. At first, Hannibal thought Will was just avoiding his gaze, but when he did it continuously, he realized he was doing something else entirely. Flashing his throat in an age-old Omegan ploy to inspire an instinctive alpha reaction. Had Will any idea of such things, he still wouldn't have been stupid enough to attempt them. He was simply doing his best to remain unobtrusive and polite in Hannibal's company, tuning him out as best he could to glean some small enjoyment out of his morning ride. Assuming he was as good as invisible to Hannibal, when he saw a rabbit at the edge of the tree line start to groom its face in the morning light, he felt safe enough to smile a little in response, his soft laughter husky and unintentionally seductive. Hannibal glowered at him. "Such naive innocence, Will? Is that difficult to summon in times such as these?" Bewildered, Will skated a glance his way, unsure what he'd managed to do to earn that strange remark. His lashes swept up in time with the turn of his limpid blue eyes to find his husband staring at him with something Will couldn't put a name to. Hannibal could, however, and decided to put a halt to it at once. "Stop it!" Hannibal sharply said, the biting intensity of his voice startling Will so much that his horse sidestepped, sensing his sudden nervous tension. Will's blue eyes widened, etched with growing fear that only made Hannibal even more certain of what he was seeing. Hannibal reined his horse to a stop and seized Will's slender arm in a tight grip. Will winced, shocked when Hannibal's fingers bit into his arm, painful and dangerous. Hannibal shook him until his perfect white teeth rattled, saying in a low growl, "Don't waste your efforts in trying your Omegan tricks on me. It would take a powerful imagination indeed to believe I would ever look at something like you and be ruled by a lust which you cannot even manage to inspire." Will made a low, distressed sound that only angered Hannibal further, because it goaded him to offer comfort. Another one of their helpless tricks. Wiles and lies, with the only goal of living like a parasite, useless for anything other than debauchery. Will had no idea what had provoked this sudden ferocity, but his instincts kicked his gift into overdrive. He was flooded with the urge to flee in terror, but Hannibal's restraining hand wrenched him back and forth, preventing it. The only other option was to submit, to cower, to abjectly accept and hope to survive, and he did it without even meaning to, every word like a blade piercing his soul. He felt like he was pouring out of the holes they left, draining away until his sense of self was replaced by Hannibal's version of him, startlingly clear and believable when he looked at himself through Hannibal's angry amber eyes. "Creatures like you are repulsive," Hannibal said, his careful low tone making the impact of his words all the more harmful, flung as they were into Will's open and malleable mind, absorbed by his empathy and sharpened by it. "Vain and empty-headed, and thinking all you need to do to be comfortable in life is to seduce your way into someone else's. Stupid, silly creatures no better than children, falling to tears at a sharp word and helpless in the face of even the most simplistic of troubles. It's sickening." Heart-thrumming with the panicked need to submit or escape, one instinct overcame all sense of self, and Will quietly sobbed, "Alpha," helplessly bonding to the man before him in a frightened self-defense, a last-ditch, desperate effort to deflect perceived deadly intent. Hannibal curled his lip at him, finding his theatrics repugnant, but he didn't let go of Will so much as give him a shove, and nearly unseated him. Will's death grip on his pommel kept him upright, but his blue eyes were huge and swimming with mingled fear and horror, but mostly shame at his rejection, the denial of something so deeply ingrained in him that he couldn't quite process the negating of it. "Omegas," Hannibal said, disgusted, looking away as if he couldn't bear the sight of his young spouse trembling beside him. "Weak and needy, and only good for whorehouses." He glanced back down at Will, completely unmoved by the devastation on Will's face, and the terrible understanding that came with it. Unable to resist twisting the proverbial knife, he murmured, "Your father should have sold you to a brothel, Will. Your nature would be much better served there." Will didn't follow when Hannibal spurred his horse ahead, but his tear-filled blue eyes followed his erect, dignified carriage as he rode off towards the village. His gift and the bond pressed those words onto him, and for the longest time he just sat there atop his mount, the tears in his eyes slowly drying as he critically examined what Hannibal had said to him. His urgent terror drew back like a wave, looming over him and waiting to crash again, sucking away what his secret heart had told him was true about himself, and leaving only something wretched and hateful in its place. The terrified bond he'd formed to Hannibal left Will open and vulnerable to his preferences over and above that of his strange gift. It was in Omega's place, after all, to be all that their Alpha desired. And Hannibal Lecter desired him to be absent, if not simply dead, reinforcing those lessons his father had taught him so painfully and so clearly. Trembling, Will closed his eyes against the beautiful day, feeling Hannibal's esteem settle on him like a heavy, dragging cloak, rendering his talents meaningless, his thoughts pointless. Plain and unneeded, burning with the shame at the sliver of hope he had the gall to invest in this marriage, Will turned his horse around and headed back to the house, feeling himself to be the very definition of repulsive that Hannibal had so callously called him.